The winter of 1847 had been merciless to the Dakota Territory, and nowhere was this cruelty more apparent than in the ramshackle settlement of Willowbrook. Snow had fallen for 3 consecutive weeks, burying the wooden buildings under thick blankets of white that seemed to muffle not just sound, but hope itself. The wind howled through the gaps in hastily built cabins, carrying with it the scent of desperation and the bitter taste of survival at any cost. Margaret Holloway pressed her face against the frost-covered window of their one-room cabin, her breath creating small clouds that quickly dissipated in the frigid air. At 15, she had already seen more hardship than most adults would experience in a lifetime. Her auburn hair, once lustrous and carefully braided by her mother's gentle hands, now hung in limp strands around her gaunt face. The green dress she wore, her only remaining garment, had been patched so many times that the original fabric was barely visible beneath the mismatched pieces of cloth. Behind her, she could hear her mother, Eleanor, pacing the small confines of their cabin with the restless energy of a caged animal. Eleanor's footsteps had worn a path in the rough wooden floor, and Margaret had memorized every creak and groan of the boards beneath her mother's feet. The sound had become a constant companion over the past month, a rhythm that spoke of anxiety, desperation, and decisions no mother should ever have to make. The trading post sat at the heart of Willowbrook like a beacon of commerce in an otherwise desolate landscape. Its weathered sign, painted in faded red letters, proclaimed it to be Henderson's General Store and Trading Post, though everyone in the settlement simply called it the Post. The building itself was more substantial than the surrounding cabins, constructed of thick logs, chinked with mud and moss, with a wide front porch that served as an unofficial gathering place for the town's residents during better times. Inside the post, the air was thick with the smell of tobacco, leather, and unwashed bodies. Shelves lined the walls, though they were notably sparse this deep into winter. A few cans of beans sat alongside bags of flour that had been carefully rationed, and bolts of fabric gathered dust in the corner. The most valuable items were kept behind the counter, where Henderson himself, a portly man with graying whiskers and calculating eyes, could keep careful watch over them. Jonas Henderson had arrived in Willowbrook 3 years earlier, with a wagon full of goods and a keen understanding of human nature. He had quickly established himself as not just a merchant, but as the unofficial bank, judge, and power broker of the settlement. His credit system had initially seemed generous, allowing families to purchase necessities against future harvests or promised work. However, as the harsh winter stretched on and resources dwindled, Henderson's terms had become increasingly steep, and his methods of collection more creative. Margaret's stomach cramped with hunger as she watched her mother's reflection in the window. Eleanor had lost considerable weight over the past month, her cheeks hollow and her eyes sunken with the particular exhaustion that comes from making impossible choices. The woman who had once sung lullabies and told stories of better days had been replaced by someone Margaret barely recognized, someone capable of things the old Eleanor would have found unthinkable. The cabin door opened with a bang, letting in a gust of frigid air that made Margaret shiver despite the thin blanket wrapped around her shoulders. Eleanor entered, her boots tracking snow across the floor, her face flushed from the cold, but her eyes burning with a desperate determination that made Margaret's heart race with foreboding. Eleanor removed her threadbare coat and hung it on the wooden peg by the door. Her movements were sharp and purposeful, lacking the gentle grace that had once characterized everything she did. She turned to face Margaret, and in that moment, the girl saw something in her mother's eyes that made her blood run cold. It was not just desperation, but a kind of terrible resolve, as if Eleanor had crossed some invisible line within herself and found a place where maternal love could be weighed against survival. The silence between them stretched like a taut rope, heavy with unspoken words and the weight of decisions that would change everything. Margaret had learned to read her mother's moods over the past difficult months, but this was different. This was the look of someone who had found a solution to their problems, but at a cost that would haunt them both forever. Eleanor moved to the small table that served as their kitchen, workspace, and dining area. Her fingers drummed against the rough wood surface, a nervous habit that had developed over the past weeks. Margaret watched her mother's hands, noting how thin they had become, how the wedding ring she still wore despite her husband's death 2 years earlier now hung loose on her finger. The fire in their small stone hearth had burned low, casting dancing shadows across the cabin walls. Margaret added another piece of wood, one of their precious few remaining logs, and watched the flames flicker back to life. The warmth felt good against her face, but it did nothing to chase away the chill that had settled in her bones, a cold that seemed to come from within rather than from the winter air outside. Eleanor cleared her throat, a sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet cabin. Margaret turned from the fire, her heart hammering against her ribs as she prepared to hear whatever news her mother had brought back from the trading post. The girl had learned to recognize the signs of her mother's internal struggles. The way Eleanor's jaw tightened when she was wrestling with difficult decisions, the way her hands trembled when she was afraid. The wind outside intensified, rattling the single window and sending a shower of snow against the glass. The sound seemed to break whatever spell had held Eleanor silent, and she finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper, but carrying the weight of finality. Eleanor's words came slowly, as if each syllable was being torn from her throat against her will. She spoke of their dwindling supplies, of the debt they owed to Henderson, of the choices that remained to them as the winter showed no signs of ending. Her voice was steady, controlled, but Margaret could see the tremor in her hands, the way her mother's eyes couldn't quite meet her own. The trading post had become more than just a place of commerce in Willowbrook. It had evolved into a center of power, where Henderson made decisions that affected the lives of everyone in the settlement. His ledger book, thick with entries recording debts and credits, had become a document of life and death in a place where survival often depended on the generosity of others. Margaret had visited the post many times over the years, usually accompanying her mother on errands or helping to carry purchases back to their cabin. She remembered the way it had felt during better times, when the shelves were full and Henderson's laugh was genuine rather than calculating. The post had been a place of warmth and human connection, where neighbors gathered to share news and children might find a piece of candy or a small toy. Now, the post felt different. The atmosphere was tense, charged with the desperation of people who had run out of options. Conversations were conducted in hushed tones, and Henderson's smile had taken on a predatory quality that made Margaret's skin crawl. The man who had once seemed like a benevolent merchant had revealed himself to be something far more dangerous. Eleanor's debt to Henderson had begun small, a few dollars for flour and beans when their own supplies ran low. But as the winter progressed and Eleanor's ability to pay diminished, the debt had grown, compounded by Henderson's interest rates and the increasing cost of basic necessities. What had started as a simple commercial transaction had become something more sinister, a relationship of power and dependency that left Eleanor with fewer options each day. The other families in Willowbrook were facing similar challenges. The Kowalski family had already lost their cabin to Henderson, forced to move in with relatives who could barely feed themselves. The widow Patterson had taken a position working in Henderson's store, though everyone knew her wages would never be enough to cover her debts. The settlement was slowly being consumed by the very man who had promised to help it thrive. Margaret had overheard conversations between her mother and other women in the settlement, whispered discussions about Henderson's methods and the prices he demanded for his continued support. Some of the women spoke of arrangements that went beyond simple commerce, transactions that required payment in forms other than money or goods. The details were never spoken aloud, but the implications hung in the air like smoke from a poorly tended fire. Eleanor's pacing had resumed, her footsteps marking time like a metronome, counting down to some inevitable conclusion. Margaret watched her mother's face, noting the way Eleanor's jaw worked, as if she were chewing on words she couldn't quite bring herself to speak. The The girl had learned to read the signs of her mother's distress, the way Eleanor's breathing became shallow when she was afraid, the way her hands clenched and unclenched when she was wrestling with difficult decisions. The cabin felt smaller than usual, as if the walls were closing in around them. Margaret had grown up in this space, had learned to walk on these rough wooden floors, had spent countless hours listening to her mother's stories and sharing in the simple pleasures of their modest life. Now, the familiar surroundings felt oppressive, charged with the weight of whatever Eleanor was struggling to say. Henderson's influence extended far beyond the trading post itself. He had become the unofficial leader of Willowbrook, the man people turned to when they needed help, and the man they feared when they couldn't pay their debts. His decisions affected everything, from who received supplies to who was allowed to stay in the settlement. In a place where survival depended on community cooperation, Henderson had positioned himself as the indispensable center around which everything else revolved. Margaret remembered her father, Thomas, who had died in a logging accident 2 years earlier. He had been a strong man, capable of providing for his family through his work in the forests that surrounded the settlement. His death had left Eleanor and Margaret vulnerable in ways that went beyond simple financial hardship. In a frontier society where a woman's security often depended on male protection, Eleanor had been forced to navigate a world that was increasingly hostile to her independence. The logging camps that dotted the territory were filled with men who had come west seeking opportunity and freedom. Some were decent men trying to build better lives for themselves and their families. Others were running from something, carrying secrets and shame that had driven them to the edges of civilization. The work was dangerous, demanding, and often fatal, but it paid well enough to attract men who had few other options. Eleanor had considered taking work at one of the logging camps, but the dangers were obvious. A woman alone in a camp full of men was vulnerable in ways that went beyond physical safety. The work itself was backbreaking, and the environment was hostile to anyone who wasn't prepared for the harsh realities of frontier life. Eleanor had skills, but they were the skills of domestic life, not the brutal physical labor that defined the logging industry. Margaret's education had been limited to what her mother could teach her, supplemented by the occasional lesson from the circuit preacher who visited Willowbrook twice a year. She could read and write, skills that were more valuable than many people realized in a place where literacy was far from universal. Eleanor had insisted on these lessons, believing that education was the key to a better life, even in the harsh environment of the frontier. The girl had dreams that extended beyond the boundaries of Willowbrook, visions of cities with paved streets and buildings that reached toward the sky. She had heard stories from travelers who passed through the settlement, tales of places where women could work in shops or even teach in schools. These dreams had sustained her through the hardest times, but now they seemed as distant and impossible as the stars that shone through their cabin window. Eleanor's debt to Henderson had reached a point where traditional forms of payment were no longer sufficient. The man had made it clear that he expected compensation for his generosity, and his definition of compensation had evolved beyond simple monetary transaction. The ledger book that recorded debts and credits had become a document of control, a way of ensuring that those who owed him money remained dependent on his continued goodwill. The wind outside had intensified, howling around the cabin with a ferocity that made the walls creak and groan. Margaret pulled her blanket tighter around her shoulders, but the cold she felt had nothing to do with the weather. It was the cold of anticipation, of knowing that her mother was about to say something that would change everything between them. Eleanor finally stopped pacing and turned to face her daughter. Her eyes were red-rimmed from exhaustion and stress, but there was a terrible clarity in them that made Margaret's heart race. The woman who had once been her protector, her source of comfort and security, now looked at her with the calculating gaze of someone who had been forced to think in terms of survival rather than love. Margaret had noticed changes in her mother over the past month. subtle shifts in behavior that spoke of internal struggles and difficult decisions. Eleanor had become more distant, more prone to long silences and sudden bursts of activity. She had taken to visiting the trading post alone, insisting that Margaret remain at the cabin, and her explanations for these trips had become increasingly vague and unsatisfactory. The girl had tried to help, offering to take work with some of the other families in the settlement, but Eleanor had refused to consider it. Margaret was too young, too vulnerable, too precious to risk in the harsh environment that surrounded them. Now, as Eleanor stood before her with that terrible resolve in her eyes, Margaret wondered if her mother's protectiveness had been less about love and more about preserving something valuable for the right moment. Henderson's trading post had become a gathering place for information as well as commerce. Travelers passing through the settlement would often stop to share news from other parts of the territory, stories of opportunities and dangers that lay beyond the boundaries of Willowbrook. Margaret had listened to these conversations with fascination, absorbing details about the larger world that existed beyond her small experience. The logging camps were always in need of workers, and the pay was good for those who could survive the dangerous work. The stories that came back from the camps were mixed, tales of men who had found prosperity alongside warnings about the brutal conditions and high mortality rates. The work was seasonal, dependent on weather and the availability of timber, but it offered one of the few reliable sources of income in the territory. Eleanor had connections to the logging industry through her late husband, men who had known Thomas and might be willing to help his widow in her time of need. However, these connections came with their own complications, relationships that might require forms of payment that Eleanor was not prepared to consider. The frontier was a place where traditional social conventions were often suspended, where survival sometimes demanded compromises that would be unthinkable in more civilized settings. Margaret had overheard her mother's conversations with other women in the settlement, hushed discussions about the choices available to women in desperate circumstances. The options were limited and often degrading, but they existed for those who were willing to compromise their dignity for survival. Eleanor had always insisted that they would find another way, that there had to be alternatives to the arrangements that other women had made. The cabin's single room served multiple purposes, functioning as kitchen, bedroom, and living space all at once. Margaret had grown up in this confined space, had learned to appreciate the efficiency of their modest arrangements. Now, the room felt oppressive, charged with the weight of whatever decision Eleanor was struggling to make. Every familiar object seemed to carry additional meaning, as if the basic furnishings of their life were being evaluated for their potential value or significance. Eleanor's hands trembled as she reached for the wooden chair that sat beside their small table. She gripped the back of the chair so tightly that her knuckles turned white, using it to steady herself as she prepared to speak the words that would shatter the fragile peace they had maintained. Margaret watched her mother's face, noting the way Eleanor's breathing had become shallow and rapid, the way her eyes darted around the room as if looking for an escape from what she was about to do. The fire in the hearth crackled and popped, sending sparks up the chimney and casting dancing shadows across the cabin walls. The warmth felt good against Margaret's back, but it did nothing to chase away the chill that had settled in her heart. She had learned to read her mother's moods, to recognize the signs of Eleanor's internal struggles, and everything about her mother's current behavior suggested that they were approaching a crisis point. Henderson's power in Willowbrook extended beyond his role as merchant and creditor. He had become the unofficial judge of disputes, the man who decided who received help and who was left to fend for themselves. His opinions carried weight in the settlement, and his disapproval could mean social isolation or worse. Eleanor had been careful to maintain good relations with Henderson, but Margaret had noticed the strain in her mother's voice when she spoke of him, the way Eleanor's jaw tightened when his name was mentioned. The trading post's ledger book had become a document of power and control, a record of who owed what to whom and what forms of payment were acceptable. Henderson kept the book locked in a wooden box behind the counter, but everyone in the settlement knew that their names were recorded in its pages, along with detailed accounts of their debts and obligations. The book had become a symbol of Henderson's authority, a physical manifestation of the hold he had over the people of Willowbrook. Eleanor's debt had reached a point where traditional payment was no longer possible. The woman who had once been proud of her independence and self-reliance had been forced to consider alternatives that would have been unthinkable in better times. Henderson had made it clear that he was willing to accept other forms of compensation, arrangements that would allow Eleanor to clear her debt while providing him with something he valued more than money. Margaret had begun to understand the true nature of her situation over the past few weeks, picking up clues from overheard conversations and her mother's increasingly strange behavior. The girl was not naive. She had lived in a frontier settlement long enough to understand that desperate times called for desperate measures. However, she had not fully grasped the extent to which their circumstances had deteriorated or the price that might be demanded for their continued survival. Eleanor's voice, when she finally spoke, was barely above a whisper, but it carried the weight of finality. She told Margaret about their debt, about Henderson's demands, about the choices that remained to them as the winter showed no signs of ending. Her words were carefully chosen, delivered with the controlled precision of someone who had rehearsed this conversation many times in her head. The trading post had become more than just a place of business. It had evolved into a center of power, where Henderson made decisions that affected the lives of everyone in the settlement. His influence extended into every aspect of life in Willowbrook, from who received supplies to who was allowed to stay in the community. The man who had once seemed like a benevolent merchant had revealed himself to be something far more dangerous and calculating. Margaret listened to her mother's words with growing horror, understanding finally the full extent of their situation and the price that would be demanded for their survival. Eleanor spoke of arrangements that had been made, of agreements that could not be undone, of decisions that would change everything between them. The woman who had once been her protector had become something else entirely, someone capable of sacrifices that the old Eleanor would have found unthinkable. The wind outside intensified, rattling the cabin's single window and sending a shower of snow against the glass. The sound seemed to emphasize the isolation of their situation, the way they were trapped not just by the weather, but by circumstances that had spiraled beyond their control. Margaret pulled her blanket tighter around her shoulders, but the cold she felt had nothing to do with the winter air outside. Eleanor's explanation continued, her voice growing stronger as she spoke of the practical aspects of their situation. She described Henderson's proposal, the terms of the arrangement that would clear their debt and ensure their survival through the remainder of the winter. Her words were delivered with the matter-of-fact tone of someone discussing a business transaction, but Margaret could see the pain in her mother's eyes, the way Eleanor's hands trembled despite her controlled voice. The girl had known this moment would come, had sensed it in her mother's behavior over the past weeks. Eleanor had been preparing for this conversation, gathering the courage to speak the words that would change everything between them. Now, as the truth was finally revealed, Margaret felt a strange sense of relief mixed with horror. The uncertainty was over, but the reality was worse than anything she had imagined. Henderson's arrangement was simple in its brutality. Eleanor's debt would be forgiven, and they would be provided with enough supplies to last through the remainder of the winter. In exchange, Margaret would go to work for Henderson, helping him with various tasks around the trading post. The arrangement would be temporary, Eleanor insisted, just until spring, when other options might become available. Margaret understood immediately that this was not about work in any traditional sense. Henderson's reputation in the settlement was well known, and his interest in young women was something that had been whispered about but never openly discussed. Eleanor was essentially trading her daughter's innocence for their survival, a transaction that would save their lives but destroy something precious that could never be recovered. The cabin fell silent except for the crackling of the fire, and the howling of the wind outside. Margaret stared at her mother, trying to process the magnitude of what Eleanor had just revealed. The woman who had raised her, who had taught her about dignity and self-respect, who had always insisted that they would find another way, had made a decision that reduced Margaret to a commodity to be traded for food and shelter. Eleanor's face was streaked with tears, but her voice remained steady as she continued to explain the details of the arrangement. She spoke of Henderson's assurances, of his promises to treat Margaret well, of the temporary nature of the situation. Her words sounded hollow even to her own ears, justifications for a decision that both of them knew was wrong, but that Eleanor believed was necessary for their survival. Margaret felt a strange numbness spreading through her body, a protective mechanism that allowed her to hear her mother's words without completely breaking down. She had always known that life on the frontier was harsh, that survival sometimes required difficult choices, but she had never imagined that her own mother would make this particular choice. The woman who had once been her hero had become something else entirely, someone capable of sacrifices that felt more like betrayals. The fire in the hearth began to die down, the flames growing smaller as the wood was consumed. Margaret watched the dancing light with a kind of detached fascination, noting how the shadows on the walls seemed to shift and change like living things. The warmth against her back was comforting, but it felt temporary, as if everything familiar and safe was about to disappear. Eleanor moved closer to her daughter, reaching out as if to touch Margaret's face, but the girl flinched away instinctively. The gesture was intended to be comforting, but it felt like a violation, a reminder of the intimacy that had been destroyed by Eleanor's decision. Margaret had lost more than just her freedom. She had lost the mother she had known and loved, the woman who had once been her protector and advocate. The wind outside had become a constant presence, a reminder of the harsh world that surrounded their small cabin. Margaret listened to its howling with new understanding, hearing in it the voice of a landscape that demanded terrible prices for the simple act of survival. The frontier was not just a place of opportunity and freedom. It was also a place where people were reduced to their most basic needs and forced to make choices that would haunt them forever. Eleanor's voice grew softer as she continued to speak, her words becoming more personal as she tried to explain her decision in terms that Margaret might understand. She spoke of love, of the lengths a mother would go to protect her child, of the hope that this arrangement would give them both a chance at a better future. Her justifications sounded hollow, but Margaret could hear the genuine pain in her mother's voice, the agony of a woman who had been forced to choose between two impossible options. The trading post loomed in Margaret's mind like a prison, a place where she would be trapped by circumstances beyond her control. She had visited Henderson's store many times over the years, but now she tried to imagine what it would be like to work there, to be under the constant scrutiny of a man whose intentions she feared to contemplate. The familiar building had been transformed by her mother's words into something sinister and threatening. Henderson's reputation in the settlement was well established, though much of what was known about him was based on whispered conversations and careful implications rather than direct accusations. He was a man who took what he wanted, who had positioned himself as the indispensable center of the community's survival. Margaret had always felt uncomfortable around him, sensing something predatory in his manner, but she had never imagined that she would be delivered into his power by her own mother. Eleanor's tears had stopped, but her face remained etched with the lines of someone who had aged years in the space of a single conversation. She looked at Margaret with eyes that pleaded for understanding, for forgiveness, for some sign that their relationship might survive this betrayal. The woman who had once been so strong and capable now seemed fragile, broken by the weight of the decision she had made. Margaret felt a complex mixture of emotions as she processed her mother's words. There was anger, certainly, a burning sense of betrayal that made her want to lash out at Eleanor for reducing her to a bargaining chip. But there was also a terrible understanding, a recognition that their situation had truly become desperate, and that Eleanor's choice, however wrong it might be, had been made out of love rather than malice. The cabin felt different now, charged with the weight of what had been revealed. Every familiar object seemed to carry new meaning, as if the basic furnishings of their life were being evaluated for their potential significance in light of the coming separation. Margaret looked around the small room that had been her entire world, knowing that everything was about to change in ways that could not be undone. Eleanor stood up from her chair, her movements stiff and awkward, as if the conversation had physically aged her. She moved to the window and looked out at the snow-covered landscape, her reflection ghost-like in the frost-covered glass. The woman who had once moved with grace and confidence now seemed uncertain, hesitant, as if she were no longer sure of her place in the world. Margaret remained seated, her blanket pulled tightly around her shoulders like armor against the cold reality of her situation. She studied her mother's profile, noting the way Eleanor's shoulders sagged with the weight of her decision, the way her hands trembled as she gripped the window frame. The woman who had once been her source of strength and comfort had become something else entirely, someone capable of sacrifices that felt more like betrayals. The wind outside continued its relentless howling, a sound that seemed to echo the turmoil in Margaret's heart. She had always found comfort in the familiar sounds of their cabin, the creaking of the wooden walls, the crackling of the fire, the gentle rhythm of her mother's breathing. Now these sounds seemed foreign and threatening, as if everything familiar and safe was about to disappear. Eleanor turned from the window and looked at her daughter with eyes that held a mixture of love and desperation. She spoke of the arrangement with Henderson as if it were a temporary solution, a way of buying time until better options became available. Her words were meant to be comforting, but they sounded hollow to Margaret's ears, justifications for a decision that both of them knew was wrong, but that Eleanor believed was necessary for their survival. The girl had always trusted her mother's judgment, had believed that Eleanor would find a way to protect them from the harsh realities of frontier life. Now, that trust had been shattered, replaced by a terrible understanding of how desperate their situation had become. Margaret felt as if she were seeing her mother clearly for the first time, recognizing the fear and weakness that had always been hidden beneath Eleanor's facade of strength and competence. Henderson's trading post had become more than just a place of business. It had evolved into a symbol of power and control in Willowbrook. The man who operated it had positioned himself as the indispensable center of the community's survival, and his decisions affected every aspect of life in the settlement. Margaret had always understood that Henderson was important, but she had never fully grasped the extent of his influence or the price that might be demanded for his continued support. Eleanor's voice grew softer as she continued to speak, her words becoming more personal as she tried to explain her decision in terms that Margaret might understand. She spoke of love, of sacrifice, of the hope that this arrangement would give them both a chance at a better future. Her justifications sounded hollow, but Margaret could hear the genuine pain in her mother's voice, the agony of a woman who had been forced to choose between impossible options. The cabin's single room had always felt cozy and secure, a refuge from the harsh world outside. Now it felt oppressive, charged with the weight of what had been revealed. Margaret looked around the familiar space with new eyes, seeing it not as a home, but as a prison from which she was about to be released into something far worse. Eleanor approached her daughter slowly, as if afraid that any sudden movement might shatter the fragile peace that remained between them. She knelt beside Margaret's chair, her eyes level with her daughter's, and spoke in a voice that was barely above a whisper. Her words were meant to be comforting, but they carried the weight of finality, the recognition that their relationship had been fundamentally changed by the decision that had been made. Margaret looked into her mother's eyes and saw there a reflection of her own pain and confusion. Eleanor was not a villain, not a woman who had made this choice out of cruelty or indifference. She was a desperate mother who had been forced to make an impossible decision, and the weight of that choice was visible in every line of her face. The knowledge that Eleanor was suffering too did not make Margaret's situation any easier to bear, but it added a layer of complexity to her feelings that made simple anger impossible. The wind outside had begun to die down, but the silence it left behind was almost more unsettling than the constant noise had been. Margaret listened to the quiet sounds of the cabin, the settling of the wooden walls, the soft hiss of the dying fire, and realized that these familiar sounds would soon be replaced by the alien environment of Henderson's trading post. Everything that had defined her world was about to change, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. Eleanor's hands shook as she reached out to touch Margaret's face, a gesture that had once been comforting but now felt like a goodbye. The woman who had once been her daughter's protector had become something else entirely, someone who had made a choice that would haunt them both forever. Margaret did not pull away from her mother's touch, but she did not lean into it either, accepting the gesture with the passive resignation of someone who had run out of options. The trading post loomed in Margaret's imagination like a dark cloud on the horizon, a place where she would be trapped by circumstances beyond her control. She had visited Henderson's store many times over the years, but now she tried to imagine what it would be like to work there, to be under the constant scrutiny of a man whose intentions she feared to contemplate. The familiar building had been transformed by her mother's words into something sinister and threatening. Henderson's reputation in Willowbrook was well established among the women of the settlement, though much of what was known about him was based on whispered conversations and careful implications rather than direct accusations. He was a man who took what he wanted, who had positioned himself as the indispensable center of the community's survival. Margaret had always felt uncomfortable around him, sensing something predatory in his manner, but she had never imagined that she would be delivered into his power by her own mother. Eleanor rose from her kneeling position beside Margaret's chair, her movements stiff and awkward, as if the conversation had physically aged her. She moved back to the window and looked out at the snow-covered landscape, her reflection ghost-like in the frost-covered glass. The woman who had once moved with grace and confidence now seemed uncertain, hesitant, as if she were no longer sure of her place in the world or her role as Margaret's mother. Margaret remained seated, her blanket pulled tightly around her shoulders like armor against the cold reality of her situation. She studied her mother's profile, noting the way Eleanor's shoulders sagged with the weight of her decision, the way her hands trembled as she gripped the window frame. The woman who had once been her source of strength and comfort had become something else entirely, someone capable of sacrifices that felt more like betrayals. The fire in the hearth had burned down to glowing embers, casting a dim red light across the cabin walls. Margaret watched the dying flames with a kind of detached fascination, noting how they seemed to struggle against the inevitable darkness that was closing in around them. The warmth against her back was fading, and she knew that soon the cabin would be cold and dark, a fitting reflection of the future that awaited her. Eleanor's voice, when she spoke again, was barely audible, but it carried the weight of finality. She told Margaret that the arrangement with Henderson would begin the next morning, that there was no more time for discussion or preparation. The decision had been made, the terms agreed upon, and now all that remained was to accept the consequences of their desperate situation. Margaret listened to her mother's words with growing numbness, understanding that her childhood had ended with this conversation. The girl had always known that life on the frontier was harsh, that survival sometimes required difficult choices, but she had never imagined that her own mother would make this particular choice. Eleanor had always been her hero, the woman who had raised her with love and dignity, who had taught her about self-respect and moral courage. Now, that hero had been revealed as someone capable of sacrifices that felt more like betrayals. Margaret felt a strange sense of detachment as she processed the magnitude of what her mother had revealed. The woman who had once been her protector had become something else entirely. Someone who had made a decision that would change everything between them. The knowledge that Eleanor was suffering too did not make Margaret's situation any easier to bear, but it added a layer of complexity to her feelings that made simple anger impossible. The wind outside had begun to pick up again, rattling the cabin's single window and sending a shower of snow against the glass. The sound seemed to emphasize the isolation of their situation, the way they were trapped not just by the weather, but by circumstances that had spiraled beyond their control. Margaret pulled her blanket tighter around her shoulders, but the cold she felt had nothing to do with the winter air outside. Eleanor turned from the window one final time and looked at her daughter with eyes that held a mixture of love, desperation, and terrible resolve. She spoke of the arrangement with Henderson as if it were a temporary solution, a way of buying time until better options became available. Her words were meant to be comforting, but they sounded hollow to Margaret's ears, justifications for a decision that both of them knew was wrong, but that Eleanor believed was necessary for their survival. The cabin fell silent except for the crackling of the dying fire and the howling of the wind outside. Margaret stared at her mother, trying to process the magnitude of what Eleanor had just revealed. The woman who had raised her, who had taught her about dignity and self-respect, who had always insisted that they would find another way, had made a decision that reduced Margaret to a commodity to be traded for food and shelter. As the embers in the fireplace began to fade and the cold started to seep through the cracks in the cabin walls, Margaret realized that her life as she had known it was over. Tomorrow, she would begin a new existence under Henderson's roof, trapped by circumstances beyond her control and abandoned by the one person she had trusted to protect her. The girl who had once dreamed of cities and education and a better life now faced a future that seemed darker than the winter night outside. But even as despair threatened to overwhelm her, Margaret felt a small spark of something that might have been defiance. She was not helpless, not entirely without resources or options. The girl who had learned to read and write, who had absorbed stories of courage and determination from her mother's teachings, was not prepared to surrender completely to the fate that had been chosen for her. The morning came too soon, arriving with a pale grey light that filtered through the frost-covered window like a reluctant messenger bearing unwelcome news. Margaret had barely slept, spending most of the night staring at the rough wooden ceiling and listening to her mother's restless movements in the bed they shared. Eleanor had tossed and turned throughout the dark hours, her breathing irregular and punctuated by soft sounds that might have been sobs or prayers. Margaret rose before her mother, moving quietly through the familiar routine of starting the fire and preparing what little breakfast they could manage from their dwindling supplies. The normalcy of these tasks felt surreal, given what the day would bring, but she found comfort in the familiar motions, in the simple act of caring for herself and her mother one last time in their shared home. Eleanor emerged from the bed looking haggard and older than her 35 years. Her auburn hair, once her pride, hung in tangled strands around her face, and her eyes were red-rimmed from crying and lack of sleep. She moved through the cabin like a ghost, touching familiar objects as if saying goodbye to each one individually. The woman who had once filled their small space with warmth and laughter now seemed diminished, reduced by the weight of her decision. The two women shared their meager breakfast in silence, each lost in her own thoughts about what the day would bring. Margaret found herself studying her mother's face, trying to memorize every detail before their relationship was forever changed by what was about to happen. Eleanor's hands shook as she lifted her cup of weak coffee to her lips, and Margaret noticed how thin her mother had become, how the hardships of the winter had carved away the softness that had once defined her features. A knock at the cabin door shattered the fragile peace of their morning routine. Both women knew who it would be before Eleanor rose to answer it, her movements slow and reluctant, as if she could delay the inevitable by simply taking her time. The sound of Henderson's voice carried through the thin wooden door, cheerful and businesslike, as if he were conducting any ordinary transaction rather than collecting on a debt that would destroy a young girl's innocence. Henderson entered their cabin without waiting for an invitation, his bulky frame filling the doorway and seeming to consume the available space. He was dressed in his finest clothes, a wool coat and pressed trousers that spoke of prosperity in a settlement where most people wore patched and mended garments. His grey whiskers were freshly trimmed, and his eyes held a satisfaction that made Margaret's skin crawl with revulsion and fear. The merchant's gaze swept over Margaret with the appraising look of someone evaluating a purchase, noting her height, her developing figure, the auburn hair that she had inherited from her mother. His smile was meant to be reassuring, but there was something predatory about it that made Margaret want to shrink into herself, to become invisible beneath his scrutiny. Henderson spoke to Eleanor as if Margaret were not present, discussing the terms of their arrangement with the casual tone of someone concluding a business deal. Eleanor's voice was barely audible as she confirmed the details of their agreement, her words coming in short, clipped sentences that suggested she was fighting to maintain her composure. Henderson nodded approvingly, producing a small leather pouch that jingled with the sound of coins. He placed it on their table with a flourish, payment for services not yet rendered, a down payment on Margaret's future that made the girl feel sick to her stomach. Margaret watched this transaction with growing horror, understanding finally the full extent of her mother's betrayal. Eleanor was not just allowing this to happen, she was actively participating in it, accepting payment for her daughter's freedom as if Margaret were livestock being sold at market. The woman who had once taught her about dignity and self-respect was now demonstrating the exact opposite, showing Margaret that survival could require the abandonment of every principle they had once held dear. Henderson's attention turned to Margaret, his voice taking on a false kindness that fooled no one in the small cabin. He spoke of the work she would be doing, the comfortable quarters he had prepared for her, the opportunities for learning that would come from working in his establishment. His words were carefully chosen to sound benign, but Margaret could hear the underlying threats, the implications of what would happen if she failed to meet his expectations. The girl found her voice for the first time since Henderson's arrival, asking about the specific nature of her duties and the length of her commitment. Her questions were met with vague reassurances and promises that everything would be explained in due time. Henderson's evasiveness confirmed Margaret's worst fears about what awaited her, but she continued to ask questions, asserting what little control she had left over her situation. Eleanor's face crumpled as she listened to the exchange between Henderson and her daughter, the reality of what she had done becoming impossible to ignore. The woman who had convinced herself that this arrangement was temporary, that it was the only way to ensure their survival, now saw it for what it truly was: the sale of her daughter's innocence to a man who had no intention of treating her with dignity or respect. Henderson's patience with Margaret's questions began to wear thin, his false kindness giving way to a more authoritative tone that revealed his true nature. He reminded Eleanor of their agreement, of the debt that had been forgiven and the supplies that had been provided, making it clear that the transaction was final and that further discussion was pointless. Margaret was his property now, at least temporarily, and he would not tolerate interference in his business affairs. The moment of departure arrived with brutal suddenness, Henderson announcing that it was time to go and that Margaret should gather whatever personal belongings she wished to bring with her. The girl looked around their cabin one last time, trying to decide what items might provide comfort in her new circumstances. She chose carefully, selecting a small wooden box that contained her few treasures, a worn copy of a book of poetry that her father had given her, and a locket that had belonged to her grandmother. Eleanor's breakdown was complete as Margaret prepared to leave, the woman's careful composure finally cracking under the weight of what she had done. She reached for her daughter with desperate hands, trying to offer comfort and reassurance that neither of them believed. Margaret allowed herself to be embraced, but she felt nothing except a terrible emptiness where her love for her mother had once resided. Henderson's impatience was evident as he watched the farewell between mother and daughter, his foot tapping against the wooden floor in a rhythm that suggested he had other business to attend to. He spoke of schedules and responsibilities, of the importance of punctuality in his establishment, making it clear that emotional displays were a luxury he would not tolerate in his employee. Margaret pulled away from her mother's embrace and walked toward the door, her back straight and her head held high despite the circumstances. She would not give Henderson the satisfaction of seeing her breakdown, would not provide him with evidence of the power he held over her. The girl who had once dreamed of education and independence now faced a future that seemed darker than the winter landscape outside, but she was determined to meet it with whatever dignity she could muster. The walk from the cabin to Henderson's trading post felt like a funeral procession, Margaret's footsteps marking time with the finality of everything she was leaving behind. The snow crunched beneath their feet and the cold air bit at her face, but these physical discomforts were nothing compared to the emotional devastation of what had just occurred. Behind her, she could hear her mother's sobs carrying on the wind, a sound that would haunt her for the rest of her life. Henderson's trading post looked different in the pale morning light, less like a place of commerce and more like a prison where Margaret would serve a sentence for crimes she had never committed. The building that had once seemed familiar and welcoming now loomed over her like a monument to her mother's desperation and her own helplessness. Whatever awaited her inside, Margaret knew that the girl who had woken up in her mother's cabin that morning would not be the same person who emerged from this experience. The merchant produced a key from his pocket and unlocked the front door of his establishment, gesturing for Margaret to enter ahead of him. As she crossed the threshold, she felt as if she were leaving one world behind and entering another, a place where the rules she had grown up with no longer applied and where survival would require forms of compromise she had never imagined. The door closed behind them with a sound like the sealing of a tomb, and Margaret's new life began. But even in this moment of ultimate despair, something stirred within Margaret that Henderson had not anticipated. The girl who had been traded like livestock possessed a spirit that could not be bought or sold, a determination that had been forged in the harsh crucible of frontier life. Whatever ordeals awaited her in Henderson's establishment, Margaret carried within herself the seeds of her own salvation, though she did not yet know how they might grow. Unknown to either Margaret or Henderson, their arrival at the trading post had been observed by a figure standing in the shadows of the pine forest that bordered the settlement. The man who watched from among the trees was tall and broad-shouldered, with the weathered hands and steady gaze of someone who had spent his life working in the wilderness. His name was Samuel Blackwood, and he was a lumberjack who had come to Willowbrook on business that had nothing to do with the drama unfolding before his eyes. Samuel had worked the logging camps of the Dakota Territory for more than a decade, earning a reputation as a man of integrity in a profession that attracted more than its share of rogues and desperados. He was known for his fairness in dealing with other workers, his skill with an axe, and his complete lack of tolerance for the kind of exploitation he was witnessing. The sight of a young girl being delivered to Henderson's establishment under circumstances that were clearly questionable stirred something in Samuel that he had thought long dormant. The lumberjack had heard stories about Henderson's business practices, whispered rumors about arrangements that went beyond simple commerce. Samuel had dismissed these tales as frontier gossip, the kind of speculation that flourished in isolated communities where entertainment was scarce and people's private lives provided the only available drama. Now, seeing Margaret's obvious distress and Henderson's satisfied demeanor, Samuel began to understand that the rumors might have been based on unfortunate truth. Samuel's own history had given him particular sensitivity to situations where the powerful preyed upon the helpless. He had grown up in circumstances that were not entirely dissimilar to Margaret's current situation, had experienced firsthand what it meant to be at the mercy of those who held economic power over him. The sight of Henderson claiming his prize triggered memories that Samuel had spent years trying to forget, reminders of his own vulnerability and the choices he had been forced to make in order to survive. The lumberjack remained hidden among the trees, wrestling with the question of whether he had any right or responsibility to intervene in a situation that was none of his business. Samuel was not a man who looked for trouble, and he understood that challenging Henderson would likely make him enemies in a community where he might need to conduct future business. However, he was also not a man who could easily walk away from injustice, particularly when it involved someone as young and obviously helpless as Margaret appeared to be. As Samuel watched Henderson escort Margaret into the trading post, he found himself thinking about the choices that lay before him. He could complete his business in Willowbrook and return to the logging camp, telling himself that what happened between Henderson and his new employee was none of his concern. Alternatively, he could find a way to involve himself in the situation, though doing so would require careful planning and considerable risk. The lumberjack's contemplation was interrupted by the sound of approaching footsteps, and he melted deeper into the shadows of the forest as Eleanor Holloway stumbled past his hiding place. Margaret's mother was clearly in distress, her movements erratic and her breathing labored as she made her way back toward the cabin she had shared with her daughter. Samuel could hear her sobbing, a sound that carried clearly in the crisp morning air and left no doubt about her emotional state. Eleanor's obvious anguish provided Samuel with additional confirmation that something was seriously wrong with the arrangement he had witnessed. A mother who was genuinely comfortable with her daughter's employment would not be displaying such extreme distress, and Eleanor's behavior suggested that she was wrestling with consequences that went far beyond simple separation anxiety. Samuel had seen enough of human nature to recognize genuine guilt and regret when he encountered it. The lumberjack waited until Eleanor had disappeared into her cabin before emerging from his hiding place among the trees. He stood at the edge of the forest, studying Henderson's trading post with new eyes and considering the possibilities for intervention that might be available to him. Samuel was not an impulsive man, but he was also not someone who could ignore injustice when it was taking place directly in front of him. Samuel's business in Willowbrook involved the purchase of supplies for the logging camp where he worked, materials that could only be obtained from Henderson's trading post. This gave him a legitimate reason to visit the establishment, though he would need to be careful about how he conducted his reconnaissance. Henderson was not a fool, and any obvious interest in his new employee would likely be met with suspicion and hostility. The lumberjack began to formulate a plan as he walked toward the trading post, his mind working through the various approaches he might take to assess Margaret's situation and determine whether intervention was warranted. Samuel had learned patience during his years in the logging camps, had developed the ability to observe and analyze before taking action. These skills would serve him well in navigating the delicate situation that lay ahead. As Samuel approached Henderson's establishment, he could see movement through the windows, shadows that suggested activity within the building. He wondered what Margaret was experiencing in those first moments of her new life, whether she was being treated with the dignity that Henderson had promised, or whether the merchant's true nature was already beginning to reveal itself. The lumberjack's hands clenched into fists as he considered the possibilities, his anger building at the thought of what might be happening behind those walls. Henderson's trading post stood at the center of Willowbrook like a spider at the heart of its web, drawing in the desperate and the vulnerable with promises of help that came at prices that were often too high to pay. Samuel had encountered similar establishments throughout the territory, places where commerce and exploitation merged in ways that left the weak at the mercy of the strong. The sight of the building filled him with a familiar anger, a rage that he had learned to control but never entirely overcome. The lumberjack paused at the front door of the trading post, taking a deep breath to compose himself before entering. He would need to appear casual, interested only in conducting business and gathering supplies for his return to the logging camp. Any sign of his true concern for Margaret's welfare would likely result in Henderson becoming suspicious and protective of his new acquisition. Samuel pushed open the door of the trading post and stepped inside, immediately noting the layout of the building and the location of its occupants. Henderson stood behind the main counter, his attention focused on some paperwork, while Margaret was visible near the back of the store, arranging items on a shelf with mechanical precision that suggested she was trying to keep herself busy and avoid thinking about her situation. The merchant looked up as Samuel entered, his face brightening with the false warmth that he reserved for potential customers. Henderson's greeting was effusive, welcoming Samuel to his establishment and expressing his eagerness to help with whatever supplies might be needed. The man's performance was smooth and practiced, but Samuel could detect the underlying calculation in Henderson's manner, the way he was already assessing the potential profit from this new customer. Samuel responded to Henderson's greeting with carefully measured politeness, explaining that he was representing a logging camp that was in need of various supplies and equipment. He produced a list that he had prepared, items that were genuinely needed, but that would also provide him with an excuse to spend time in the store and observe the interaction between Henderson and Margaret. Margaret remained focused on her task of organizing merchandise, but Samuel could see the tension in her posture, the way she held herself as if expecting trouble at any moment. The girl's obvious distress confirmed his suspicions about the nature of her situation, and he found himself struggling to maintain his composed facade while witnessing what appeared to be the early stages of her exploitation. Henderson's attention was completely focused on the business at hand, his eyes lighting up as he calculated the profit that could be made from Samuel's substantial order. The merchant began pulling items from his shelves and discussing prices with the enthusiasm of someone who had not seen such a large sale in quite some time. Samuel played his role perfectly, asking detailed questions about quality and availability while secretly observing every interaction between Henderson and his new employee. As the transaction progressed, Samuel began to understand the full scope of Margaret's predicament. She was clearly being treated as more than just an employee, with Henderson making comments and gestures that suggested a level of ownership that went far beyond any normal business relationship. The girl's responses were minimal and carefully controlled, as if she were afraid that saying the wrong thing might result in consequences she was not prepared to face. Samuel's anger continued to build as he witnessed Henderson's behavior, but he forced himself to maintain his customer facade while gathering the information he would need to formulate a plan. The lumberjack had learned patience during his years in the wilderness, had developed the ability to observe and analyze before taking action. These skills would serve him well in the delicate situation that was unfolding before him. The transaction was completed with Henderson expressing his satisfaction at having found such a substantial new customer and his hope that Samuel would return for future business. The merchant's attention then turned back to Margaret, his voice taking on a proprietary tone that made Samuel's skin crawl with disgust. Henderson's true nature was becoming increasingly apparent, and the lumberjack realized that his initial suspicions had been entirely justified. Samuel left the trading post with his supplies and a growing determination to find a way to help Margaret escape from her predicament. The girl's situation was clearly desperate, and Henderson's intentions were becoming more obvious with each passing moment. The lumberjack knew that direct confrontation would likely be futile and possibly dangerous, but he was equally certain that he could not simply walk away from what he had witnessed. As Samuel loaded his supplies onto his wagon, he began to formulate a plan that would require careful timing and considerable risk. The lumberjack had resources that Henderson did not know about, connections in the logging industry that might provide alternatives to Margaret's current situation. Samuel was not a rich man, but he had saved money over his years of hard work, and he was prepared to use those savings if it meant helping an innocent girl escape from a predator. The winter sun was beginning to set as Samuel prepared to leave Willowbrook, but he knew that his involvement in Margaret's situation was just beginning. The girl who had been traded for supplies and debt forgiveness had unknowingly gained an ally, someone who understood the value of human dignity and was prepared to fight for it. Samuel's wagon rolled out of the settlement as darkness fell, but the lumberjack's thoughts remained focused on the young woman he had left behind and the plan that was beginning to take shape in his mind. Margaret stood at the window of Henderson's trading post, watching Samuel's wagon disappear into the gathering darkness and wondering about the man who had seemed so different from the other customers who visited the store. There had been something in the lumberjack's eyes, a quality of attention and concern that suggested he had seen more than he had revealed. For the first time since her mother's betrayal, Margaret felt a small spark of something that might have been hope, though she was afraid to acknowledge it even to herself. Henderson's voice called her away from the window, summoning her to begin the evening routine that would define her new life. Margaret turned from the glass with reluctance, knowing that whatever lay ahead would test her in ways she had never imagined. But the memory of the lumberjack's steady gaze remained with her, a reminder that not everyone in the world was prepared to sacrifice the innocent for their own gain. The first chapter of Margaret's ordeal was drawing to a close, but her story was far from over. In the darkness beyond Willowbrook, Samuel Blackwood was already planning his return, driven by a sense of justice that would not allow him to abandon a young woman in desperate need of rescue. The winter had taken much from the settlement, but it had also brought together two people whose lives would be forever changed by their unlikely meeting. As the snow began to fall again, covering the settlement in a blanket of white that muffled sound and obscured vision, Margaret faced her first night in Henderson's establishment with a mixture of fear and determination. The girl who had been traded like a commodity possessed a strength that her mother's betrayal had not destroyed, a resilience that would be tested in the days to come, but would ultimately prove to be her salvation. The stage was set for a confrontation between those who believed that survival justified any sacrifice, and those who understood that some things were worth fighting for, regardless of the cost. Margaret's story was just beginning, and the winter that had brought her to this desperate place would also provide the backdrop for her eventual liberation. The lumberjack who had witnessed her plight was already planning his return, bringing with him the possibility of redemption and the promise that hope could survive even in the darkest of circumstances.